Well, we continue our journey through the Psalms, and today we come to the 39th Psalm, Psalm 39. And you can, I don't know if your handouts got folded or not, but we'll start at the top there where it says, God my exceeding joy, Psalm 39, suffering in silence. So let's read the psalm together before we get into our handout. Psalm 39, for the choir director, for Yeduthun, a psalm of David. I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle, while the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I refrained even from good, and my sorrow grew worse. My heart was hot within me. While I was musing, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the extent of my days. Let me know how transient I am. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime as nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath. Selah. Surely every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. And now, Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. I have become mute. I do not open my mouth, because it is you who have done it. Remove your plague from me. Because of the opposition of your hand, I am perishing. With reproofs you chasten a man for iniquity. You consume as a moth what is precious to him. Surely every man is a mere breath. Selah. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner like all my fathers. Turn your gaze away from me, that I may smile again, before I depart and am no more. Well, we come to our handout, and we want to ask first what the setting behind the background of this poem might be. And here's another case, as I think is most of the case, we really don't know. It's some situation of illness and chastening in David's life. It's a lot like Psalm 38, the psalm we looked at last week, where David is sick under God's chastening hand. He knows it explicitly, and he prays a prayer of lament and repentance. So this psalm, like that one, deals with some period of life, perhaps the same period of life, where David suffered illness as a direct form of chastening. Here in Psalm 39, he admits in verse 8 that his troubles are the result of some sin. He says, deliver me from all my transgressions. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. And notice how in verse 10, he attaches his illness to the situation, the sin he's been in. Remove your plague from me. Because of the opposition of your hand, I am perishing. So he knows very clearly that the illness he has, whatever it is divine chastening. Now maybe, how does he know that? Well, we suggested last week that we had the same issue when we read Psalm 38. Maybe a prophet has come to him to tell him that the hand of the Lord is against you because you've done this. I mean, Nathan does this, at least at one time in David's life. Other prophets do this for the kings of Israel and Judah. So perhaps that's how he knows. However, he knows. I mean, his conscience is quickened. He is very deeply convicted, and the Lord has his attention. So this is a prayer of repentance of sorts. It's a prayer also of contemplation as he's thinking through the realities of life and what's what, and how life is so brief. Note also, letter C, that while he is still quite sick, David is visited by wicked people. Do you notice how the psalm began? In verse 1, I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle while the wicked are in my presence. And then he says, I was mute and silent. I refrained even from good. I didn't even say good things. Somehow, he is visited by wicked people. We could assume these are maybe dignitaries from other countries who have heard of his illness and they've come to pay him a visit. And so he dares not say anything to them that could be perceived as a criticism of the Lord. He's in pain and distress. So he's careful to guard what he says about his situation, lest they think wrongly about God and try to use it against him and against the realm and to bring him down. This is the same kind of thing, a similar thing we saw in Psalm 38. In Psalm 38, David is suffering because of his sin, but he has enemies who are more sinful than him who are trying to exploit that situation to bring him down or bring the kingdom down. Yeah, perhaps a little bit similar situation here. Did you notice that there's a theme that runs through the psalm? It's the theme of silence. There's a theme of silence that runs through the poem. Early in the psalm, David says that he stayed silent to others before he began speaking to God. And then at the end of the psalm, he's concerned that God will be silent in not answering his prayer. Take a look at, again, verses 12 and 13. In particular, I think it's verse 12. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Do not be silent. So that's the same kind of word he used early in the psalm. I determined I needed to be silent. But Lord, I can't have you be silent. I need you, and what he means by not being silent, I need you to respond. Hear my prayer, answer my prayer, deliver me from my sin and from these situations that they brought upon me. Well, another issue about the background of the setting, let's see, number 3 at the first page. The superscription, that is the heading, mentions Jeduthun. You see that for the choir director for Jeduthun. And actually, Jeduthun was one of the choir directors. He is mentioned in a few places in 1 Chronicles. Let's turn to one of these together. There's one listed, 1 Chronicles chapter 16. 1 Chronicles 16. It helps if I get in 1 Chronicles and not 2 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 16. If we back up a little bit to verse 37. So he left Asaph and his relatives there before the ark of the covenant of the Lord to minister before the ark continually as every day's work required. And Obed-Edom with his 68 relatives. And so there's a list now of the people who were charged with taking care of the renewal of the tabernacle. This is when David brings the ark to Jerusalem, and the tabernacle will eventually be set up there. And so this is the reestablishment of Mosaic worship. And then down in verse 41, with them were Haman and Jeduthun, and the rest who were chosen, who were designated by name to give thanks to the Lord, because his loving kindness is everlasting. And with them were Haman and Jeduthun, with trumpets and cymbals for those who would sound aloud, and with instruments for the songs of God, and the sons of Jeduthun for the gate. So Jeduthun is mentioned here a few other times in 1 Chronicles as one of the great worship leaders in the tabernacle that David renewed. So what this seems to mean back here at the beginning of the psalm, back at Psalm 39, is that Jeduthun is being here authorized by David to arrange this poem for musical presentation. So David has written the words, and Jeduthun is responsible for perhaps creating the music or adapting the music or seeing to it that it finds some place in the life of worship at the tabernacle. Now, this prayer is a very personal prayer. There are a lot of prayers in the Psalms that don't sound like things you might sing in a great congregation. But this one, even though it's very personal, and grows out of David's personal experience would be profitable for some kind of gatherings at the tabernacle, because it has within it some very specific instructional elements. That is, there are verses of teaching in this poem. It's not just his musing and hurting and crying out to God. There are statements that David makes that are very instructional, and we'll highlight them as we go through it. Let's go to the back of the page, and we'll talk about what kind of a psalm this is. Last week, I think it was last week or the week before, we talked about a dozen or so different kinds of psalms. And this is very much like the one we saw last week. It is a lament. It's a lament of the penitent. Here's a man who is repentant of his sin. The thing that's different about this psalm from Psalm 38, the big thing, is that this is a lament with reflection. This is a lament with reflection. That is, there's a lot of contemplating life. There's a lot of statements about what is man. His life is but a breath. So there's a very deep kind of reflection, almost proverb-like reflection that we find in this poem that we didn't find in the previous one. So like the previous one is what we call a penitential prayer. This would be one too. He is penitent. Penitence is not the same as penance, by the way. Penance is trying to pay for your sin. Penitence is basically the attitude of repentance. We have in Western judicial system, we have what are called penitentiaries, because the aim was to make people repentant, that they would think about what they did and they'd feel real bad about it, and then they'd be changed. We could argue how effective the system is to accomplish that, but that's where that term comes from. Now, the prayers, Psalm 38, which we looked at last week, and this one are similar and different in some key ways. Psalm 38, you might remember, we said was quasi-alphabetic, because there are 22 verses in Psalm 38, and there's 22 verses of 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. It's not they don't follow in sequence, but there's a sense of the grief that David has is being ordered and bounded. It has a start and it has a stop, and there's a flow to it. But Psalm 39 is more directly instructional. It contains within it proverb-like instruction in some of the verses. It has proverb-like instruction as he meditates on life. Another thing the way to compare these two, Psalm 38, David's concerned about his enemies taking advantage over him in his time of illness. You see that back in Psalm 38, verses 19 and 20. My enemies are vigorous and strong. Many are those who hate me wrongfully, and those who repay evil for good. They oppose me because I follow what is good. So, he's sick and he's committed sin, but boy, what these people want to do is even worse. So that's the concern in Psalm 38. But here in Psalm 39, he's more concerned about his enemies seeing him sin in his sufferings. He has sinned. He is now suffering for it. He doesn't want to sin more and compound the problem and bring some sort of shame upon the name of the Lord. So notice that verse 39 begins with, Psalm 39, verse 1, begins with, I said, I will guard my ways. In other words, here's something I was committed to. I was committed to watching my tongue, especially because there were unbelieving people, wicked people who have a totally wrong view of God, and I don't want them to take anything I say and to make things worse or to bring shame upon the name of the Lord. So there's a little bit of a different concern that he has. So that leads me to think that this psalm, Psalm 39, is a different situation than the previous. I can't say for sure. Well, before we go into the outline, I'll mention about the structure of the poem. Most of the poem is a meditative lament. Meditative lament. Meditative in the sense that there's this, again, proverb-like instruction that's woven into it. It's a lament on the frailty of life. And boy, in his sickness, he was feeling frail. and was mindful of how brief life was. And then it ends with 2 verses where there's this prayer for divine mercy. The meditative lament can be broken up into 2 sections, and each of those sections ends with a reference to man's life being a mere breath. Did you notice in verse 5, look at the end of verse 5, surely every man at his best is a mere breath. And that same statement is made at the end of verse 11. Surely every man is a mere breath. And after saying that each time, there's also that little note, that little poetic note, Salah. Salah, not Sheila, by the way. It's not calling out to Sheila. Salah, this Hebrew word that our Bibles don't even translate because we don't really know what it means. We conjecture that it was either a kind of a musical note, not as in a note of music, but a notation for the musicians to maybe play an interlude or maybe to pause. We're kind of guessing, but it often is used at breakpoints in the poem, and it seems to be clearly that here. It comes after the same phrase is repeated 2 times. So that main lament has then 2 parts. The first meditation in verses 1 to 5 gives us, I'm running out of room here. Do I have room on the back? I do. Behold, I get to pivot the board. Long have I wanted to pivot the board. Of course, now I'm making a big deal about it. Maybe it won't be that exciting. There, the Lord has pivoted. Behold, it has repented, and he could say. So, in the beginning of the first part, there's background information given, and it's not a lot of background information. It doesn't tell us when in his life this happened or what exactly happened, but there's some details that there are enemies around him, and shows his resolve to preserve his testimony before the unbelievers. So he suffers in silence before them, but then he rightly takes his prayer to the Lord. He is silent before them, but not silent before the Lord. He does finally speak to the Lord, and that's what the majority of this poem is. Yes, Frank?
I would like to make a little comment. The difference between Psalm 38 and Psalm 39. 38 would be more penitent, whereas 39 would be more lament.
No, they're both lament, but a kind of lament is a penitent prayer. Yeah.
You would say that 38 would be more penitent, and 39 would be a mixture of both?
No, they're very similar in that way. The big difference is that Psalm 39 has some direct statements where he's trying to teach people about life, where he's being really reflective, whereas Psalm 38 is a little bit more raw about his own experience.
More like being penitent. 38 being more penitent.
Perhaps there are more statements about his sin in Psalm 38 than you have in this one. Yeah. So then the second meditation is in verses 6 to 11, and that part gets more explicit about what his need is for the Lord's mercy and about his own frailty. So before we go into the visual outline chart, let me make a few points of application. This is a psalm that teaches us that there are things to learn from our sufferings. Whatever may be the cause of those sufferings, whether it's chastening or something else, there is something for us to learn. We do not automatically benefit from our sufferings. Trials do not automatically make you better. It's how you respond to your trials and your sufferings that make all the difference. There are some folks who suffer tremendously through life, but they don't really learn the lessons that they need to. And they keep wondering, why is this happening to me? And sometimes I don't know why it's happening to you, but I can tell you there's some things you ought to get out of this. So learning from our sufferings is one of the lessons, and then also living out our faith in the midst of our sufferings, knowing that people are watching how we respond.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I was just thinking sometimes maybe we do learn from our sufferings, but that doesn't mean the suffering is going to stop.
That's true. That's right. I don't want to imply that once you've learned the lesson, therefore you're guaranteed you're not going to suffer that way anymore. That's not the way it works either. Yeah. But we're much better off if we can be improved from our suffering than for it to be wasted instruction. Letter A, suffering puts our faith on display. That's something we infer from this poem. David knows that others are watching, and these others are unbelieving people, pagan people. And he doesn't want to fail the test. The big concern he has is that he's going to say something about the Lord, about what the Lord is doing to him. He knows the Lord is doing something to him. He explicitly knows that. But if he talks about that in the wrong way to the wrong people, that could be very damaging to the testimony of the Lord. These unbelieving visitors, they don't have a grid to understand everything that the Lord is trying to do. And then you also have the side, David is in pain, and maybe he's going to say something a little bit too far, Yes, it's proper to pray to the Lord and lament before the Lord, but you can cross a line and go too far. And David knows that about himself, and he's concerned about the fallout of this situation. So he doesn't want to fail the test in their eyes and then thereby bring disgrace on the Lord's name.
I find it kind of interesting too in verse 2 at the end where he says, and my sorrow grew worse. So he wasn't speaking at all good or bad. Yeah, right?
That's right.
And yet his sorrow grew worse. What does that mean?
I think, he's suffering in silence, and when you feel like you can't share with anybody, it just seems to compound it. And I think that's what, and it seems like he hasn't even really composed a prayer yet. He hasn't put his thoughts into prayer at this point until we come down to verse 4. Because actually at the end of verse 3, then I spoke with my tongue. Now, but notice he's careful who he speaks to. He speaks to the Lord first and foremost, not to the audience of people all around him. So suffering in silence is hard. I mean, there are times when there are people around you, they really don't understand what you're going through, and you feel like if you tell them, you're just kind of wasting your breath, and so you just keep it in, and that's just naturally painful. So it's good for us, though, to learn how to express ourselves to the Lord, to as some of the other psalms say, to roll our burden onto the Lord, and to be confident that he does hear us, and really his audience is the one that matters the most. So here's a lesson, though. Our suffering puts us on a stage. And, when we're suffering, there are things to tend to, and we need to be careful with our health or what have you. But there's also this other dimension there that we need to be mindful of. The people see how we respond. Our kids see how we respond to suffering. Our neighbors see how we respond to suffering. Our loved ones, some of whom we don't know the Lord, they see that. And I don't mean this to put more pressure on you. You're suffering, and now I'm going to put more pressure on you too. It's not. This isn't intended to ramp up the pressure cooker. But a big part of our faith is how we navigate troubles, and that proves. This is what the Bible speaks about: our faith being proven in times of trial and testing. It's a big part of spiritual growth. All right, letter B, here's another lesson from the Psalm. Suffering is full of latent instruction, and by latent I mean potential. And I wrote the word latent because it fit on the line, as opposed to potential, which bumped it down to another line. I was out of space. Suffering is full of potential instruction if we will gain the lessons from it. And again, that teaching, that learning, does not come automatically. We have to apply ourselves to profit the most from the things that we go through. And another point I see in this poem is that life is a brief sojourn. Life is a brief sojourn that requires God's constant grace. David says at the end of the psalm, in verse 12, do not be silent at my tears, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner like all my fathers. A stranger, this is a word for a resident alien in a land. Now this is ironic. This is the king of Israel talking. I'm a stranger. I'm an alien. Just like all of my fathers. So his fathers, his ancestors, who had been sojourners coming out of Egypt into Israel, they were really at the Lord's mercy to care for them, and he sees himself being in that same situation. David speaks this way also in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 15. 1 Chronicles 29. Verse 14, he says, "But who am I and who are my people that we should be able to offer as generously as this? For all things come from you, and from your hand we have given you. For we are sojourners before you, and tenants, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no hope. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided to build you a house for your holy name, it is from your hand, and it is yours." This is at the dedication of the materials that were going to be used to build the temple, which his son Solomon would do. Well, I'd like you now to take your handout and open it up to the outline on the inside. I'm sorry, mine's in color. Yours is turned into black and white, but you can see the colors by faith, I think, if you do. There's a little bit of green on one side, and the rest is pretty much blue. So, all right. So up at the top, there's a purpose statement for the poem. While undergoing chastening through severe sickness, David struggles in prayer with his feelings about life's frailty, his own sinfulness, and the severity of divine chastening. This is a reflective lament of a penitent man, contemplations when he was severely sick. Over on the far left side of the chart, you'll see the headings are listed, that there's the authorization of the choir director, Jeduthun, and then the author, David, is mentioned as well. The poem itself begins in verse 1, and as you can see at the top of the chart, most of it, verses 1 to 11, is a meditative lament on the frailty of life. And that lament breaks down into two parts. There's the introductory meditation, the pain of suffering in silence, in verses 1 through 5. He mentions the background to the lament in verses 1 to 3. He begins by talking about his commitment not to complain before the godless in verse 1. I said, this was my resolve, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle while the wicked are in my presence. In verse 2, he goes on to talk about how he struggled in suffering in silence. I was mute and silent. I refrained even from good. I didn't even say things that could clearly not be misunderstood. I just kept quiet, and my sorrow grew worse. My heart was hot within me. While I was musing, the fire burned. I just felt the need to talk. And so now finally, at the end of verse 3, he resolves to speak to the Lord. Speaking to the Lord is the most important part, the most important one to speak to. Then I spoke with my tongue, and then the speech begins in verse 4. And what verses 4 to 5, as you move over one slot in your outline, this is a petition for divine wisdom. He requests firstly to know the reality of life's brevity in verse 4. Lord, make me to know my end and what is the extent of my days. Let me know how transient I am. Now the Lord knows the start and the stop date of all of us. We all know our start date. We celebrate it every year, most of us. We have no idea what our last day is. The Lord knows. So David's not asking me, tell me, Lord, how much longer before I die? Just tell me what my death date is. He's not asking for a date. He's asking for an awareness that he could continue to live in the awareness that life is brief. You know, when you're really sick, you're mindful of that more than just about any other time of life. When a loved one is severely ill, you're mindful of life's brevity. And there's some discomfort in that, and yet there's also some goodness that comes out of that. It makes us reflect on what life is all about, what's most important in life. And I think David sees that there's going to be an end to this dilemma that he's in, this illness. And he wants to carry forward the perspective that he has in this time of illness. He wants to know the reality of life's brevity. He confesses in verse 5, the beginning of verse 5, his own personal transitoriness. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime as nothing in your sight. So in ancient days, they didn't have tape measures. You know, they would maybe have measuring rods. Occasionally there's reference in the Bible to someone holding a gold rod, you know, to measure the city of Jerusalem or what have you. But they didn't have the tape. So how do you measure things? Well, a cubit is this, from your elbow out to that's a rough cubit, and you can multiply those out. About the smallest unit of measurement was this, width of your hand. Not real big. Can't do a whole lot with that. So if you were to graph out David's life, any of our lives, on the scale of history, we feel like day by day is going kind of slow, but in the big scheme of things, it's over real fast. He's aware in this time of trouble that life is really, really short. In comparison to God, my lifetime is nothing in your sight. It doesn't mean you don't care about me, God. It means in comparison with you, I'm but nothing. And then at the end of verse 5, there's a reflection on human fleetingness, not just himself, but everyone. Surely every man at his best, the best of men, the longest living of men, the most important of men, is but a mere breath. That's the same kind of image that James uses. What is your life? It's even as a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. So after making that sobering statement, Salah is said, which I think is a musical notation. There'd be, I think, an interlude in the performance of the song. And then verse 6 brings us into the second half of the lament. This is the central lament, and here's where he really pours out his need for mercy and relief. It begins with a petition for forgiveness of sin in verses 6 through 8. And again, he reflects, just as he ended the last section, he starts again by reflecting on human fleetingness, that it seems like all for nothing, in one sense. Surely every man walks about as a phantom. This Hebrew word is an image. And some have conjectured he's talking about like a specter, a ghost is just an image of a whole person. It's not even a whole person. They make an uproar for nothing. Life is full and boisterous and making a big to-do, but in the end, what happens to all the stuff you amassed, all the stuff you stole, all the stuff you worked for, all the stuff you saved? Sometimes you don't even know how it's going to be cared for at the end. We have wills, to try to make clear what happens to our stuff afterwards, and you know how that goes. Sometimes that doesn't even work.
The trailer hit you in a hearse.
That's right. Yeah, you never hitch a U-Haul to the back of a hearse, do you? Now, you don't want to read this verse as if this is the only statement about the importance of life. This isn't the full statement about life's value and what have you, but in the big perspective of things, the things that we spend so much time on, in the end, are not the most enduring things. So he confesses his trust in Yahweh in verse 7. Now, Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. The most important thing in life I have is you. Me, the king of the realm, with all this stuff. I'm not even sure how this is going to be spent after I'm gone. Of course, the rest of the Old Testament history is largely a history of things being misspent. Stuff being misspent, lives being misspent, the fear of the Lord being lost. The most enduring thing David can take is the Lord himself. My hope is in you. And then he confesses his sin. He pleads to be delivered from sin and its consequences in verse 8. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. Here's a reference again to the enemies round about him, people who are unwise in the things of the Lord. If David degrades completely, they are going to misunderstand everything that's taking place. David knows that his distress is because of his sin. He's implicitly confessing his sin and asking for the Lord. He's basically saying, I've learned my lesson, Lord. Now, I need your help. Please relieve me of this trouble that I'm in. And then in verses 9, 10, and 11, he makes the plea particularly to be relieved from chastening. He's made a commitment in verse 9 not to protest to God. Verse 9, I have become mute. I do not open my mouth, because it is you who have done it. Now, obviously, he's not entirely mute. He's praying right here. All right? I mean, he's expressing himself to the Lord. So the kind of silence he's talking about is, I've resolved not to, listen, God, who do you think you are? Why are you doing this to me? This sort of bizarre ranting and raving at God as if I deserve better than what I'm receiving. So I've resolved not to do that. I'm not going to protest that way. Yes, this prayer is a lament. You could say it's a complaint, but it's a small c. That was an S. It was small c. He prays for divine restraint in God's effective discipline. This discipline of the Lord is effective. Verse 10, remove your plague from me because of the opposition of your hand. I am perishing. I can't keep going, Lord. I've learned my lesson. The beginning of verse 11, with reproofs you chasten a man for iniquity. You consume as a moth what is precious to him. The Lord is able, the things that we cherish the most, that we rely on and trust on the most, he's able to make those go away so that we're left only with him. He asks for relief here, and again he reflects at the end of verse 11 on human fleetingness. That human life is just a mere breath. Surely every man, even the king, is a mere breath. Selah. Well, the end of the poem, the last two verses, is a concluding prayer that stands apart from those meditations. He makes a plea for divine attention and grace. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ear to my cry. Do not be silent. And then he confesses his dependence on the Lord when he says, I am a stranger with you, a sojourner like all my fathers. Me, the king. Me, the one who sits on the throne. The one who governs the realm. I'm just a tenant. I'm a renter. This is all your land. My life is yours. And this is the way it's always been, but we don't always live that way. Just like my fathers were. Well, I need to keep this in mind, that my life is utterly dependent upon the Lord. And then in verse 13, he asks for the Lord to end his attentive discipline. Now, it's kind of ironic. In verse 12, the prayer, pay attention to me, God. Now, said politely, said reverently, pay attention to me, hear me, don't be silent. And then in verse 13, please stop looking at me. In verse 13, notice that, turn your gaze away from me. Now, obviously the gaze that he's thinking about is that the Lord has been looking at him sternly. And because of that, he's been suffering under discipline. He doesn't want the Lord to go away completely. He wants the countenance of the Lord to change towards him. Turn your gaze away from me that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. If you continue, Lord, to look on me this way, I will come to an end. This disease will end in my death. But I know that you can turn this around, and that you are a gracious and compassionate God, and that you hear prayers of confession. And so I long to be able to look upon your face. Most of the times in the Psalms, when the Lord's face is upon someone, it's favorably. It's like the smile of his face. But there's such a thing as the frown of his face, too. And David feels like he's wilting underneath that glance. So, we want the Lord to be present with us, but sometimes we don't want the presence of the Lord in that way, do we? And so walking in faith, walking in obedience, we have the assurance of the Lord's smile upon us. And the good news of the gospel is that in the end of life, we know that because of what Jesus Christ has done for us, that the final complexion of the Lord towards us, the enduring complexion of the Lord towards us is one of grace, that he smiles upon us with his favor. Yes, there are times of discipline and correction, but it's not judgment. It's not to utterly destroy us and bring us to hell. It's to bring us to an awareness of the reality of life. Life is brief, and we need to focus on the things that matter most. So these are some rich lessons to learn from this psalm. Yes, Selena.
And I see in the beginning that he's in the presence of the wicked and he's mute. But where he goes and opens his mouth and starts to speak, this is very personal. Are we under the impression that he's still in the presence of the wicked when he gets into the prayer of God?
I don't think so. I think the idea, he's been visited And while they were there, for however long they were there, he just kept to himself. You know, in the Old Testament, most people prayed verbally, out loud. You know, so we've kind of perfected the notion of quiet, pray to yourself sort of thing. But that was not that common. There are a few references to that in the Old, but normally people, when they prayed, it would be verbally out loud. So I think they were gone, and now he could speak. And then he records for us what it was that he said. Now, naturally, we're having to infer things. So there's necessary reading between the lines. So, anyway, I could make jokes about that. But part of interpretation is connecting the dots. So that's a great question. Well, why don't we close with prayer and ask the Lord to seal to our hearts the good lessons that we've learned this morning. Father, we're thankful for this rich poem. It's a short poem, but it's full of reflection, also of pain, but ultimately of hope and confidence that in your grace you smile upon us. We thank you for the good news of the gospel, that you look upon us through the merits of your Son. And yes, while there are times of correction, in the end you are one who looks upon us as sons and daughters. So, Lord, in our times of suffering, whether they be for chastening or whether they be just in your sovereign disposal in our life, may we take every opportunity to learn what we can for them and to know that a world is watching round about us. Our children are watching, our families and loved ones are watching. May we gain all we can from those things we go through, and may it be to your glory and to our good. In Jesus' name we pray.